In a previous discussion, we took a look at the first bucket of questions in Etikam Filipino, and that was on moral agency. This time, we're going to take a look at the second bucket, and that refers to moral context, or the situation where pagpapakatao becomes existential. Moral context refers to moral action as existential. And this existential character can only happen in context. When we look at the tradition and examine context, the reference there is to personal circumstances, understood as psychosocial, and defined strictly by the parameters of space and time, or you will find the technical terminology of locus and tempus. For contemporary discussion, the shift in context, it refers to personalism and existentialism, particularly after the World Wars, when the philosophers examined the new role or the new circumstance of human beings as literally thrown into the world or coming into existence almost against their will. Another dimension is culture, regarded also as context because it is a mental locus. We talked about kami, tayo, sila as boundaries in our understanding of human relationships. But culture is the world that you carry in your head whenever you are far away from home. So it is still a place and it is still a history. When we lift this to the level of ethical discussion, moral context refers to circumscriptions or arbitrarily delineated sets of circumstances that can build up into the constructs of katatayuan, if we refer to a personal situation, or larangan, in the sense of individuals constituting a group of related interests that pertain to a particular domain. In the larger sense, if you can think about that, then there is also a sense we can talk about as world or global ethics. Looking at the emics of Filipino context, we described it in terms of the dynamic concept of ang ginagalawan. Daigdig ng pakikipagkapwa. Because kapwa is indispensable to understanding tao at ang loob ng tao. Maaari nating usisain kung sino tayo sa sarili at pribadong pagninilay-nilay. Pero marami tayong hindi makikilala kundi sa pakikipagkapwa-tao at doon lamang sa pakikipagkapwa-tao. Sapagkat sa kanila, sa mga mata ng iba, higit nating masasalamin, makikilala kung sino nga tayo. Isa pang larangan kung saan makikilala natin ang ating loob is when loob reveals itself, as we said, through our bodies, through our word, and through objects. They constitute our reality checks. Looking at social science in the Philippines, however, there seems to be a particular definition or articulation of context provided by Psikolohiyang Filipino, where pakikipagkapwa has been determined to consist of 8 levels of interaction: progressive, concentric, and deepening. And this in turn can be grouped into 2 special sets. The first is those that characterize interactions between ibang tao, and those that are a bit more intimate, where the other is no longer ibang tao, kundi di ibang tao. Pinoy context ethics, therefore, can be characterized or moralized as pakikipagkapwa. It's made existential by the application of 3 principles. The first is pagkakaloob. This is when we open to the other as a basic condition, because it is quite possible, and it happens precisely in unethical situations and attitudes where, due to some contingent feature like race, like color, like religion, and so on, we refuse to open to the other. But to those that we open to in much more intimate relationships, there is another set of interactions where our humanity and humanization is challenged, because kailangan maghulihan tayo ng loob. And that is pagkakasing loob, a quest for commonality, a quest for what unites, what underlines the shared between me and you. And we all know how difficult this can be, because even among friends and even among spouses, pagkakasing loob is never complete. And that can be explained because loob has the structures not only of similarity but also of difference and opacity. The highest level, evidently, is that of friendship and reciprocity, which we can call, and has been described by the culture itself as pagkakalooban, where we recognize duties of reciprocity. So context can be seen evidently as a personal affair, my own circumstances. And in fact, in the tradition, the popular discussions equated context with the physical features or static placement in space and time. Moral circumstances were regarded as the temporal and geographical coordinates of the moral actor. You will find that, for example, in court proceedings, where the context of a crime is determined by the place and the timeline. A dynamic view, on the other hand, sees context as the complex of biographical and situational circumstances of the agent, the group, or the sector. And this has been recognized in its moral dimensions, for example, as the age of moral reason. There is a point at which we can determine where a child can distinguish right and wrong and can therefore be made responsible or liable or accountable for its actions. There are, on the other hand, other roles, rights, and duties which pertain to a person because of a social role or a state of life or occupation, where you distinguish the duties and the duties of a judge differently from the duties of a soldier. There is the world of work or profession, vocation, and so forth. So all of these constitute what we might call larangan or a domain, along with their corresponding responsibilities. Today, when we talk about sociocultural context, we tend to include other, more vacuous, more abstract ideas, old cultural concepts, and new social constructs, such as SES, or socioeconomic status, characterizing a particular group or society, gender, a subgroup, a subculture, resulting in issues of sexism, feminism, LGBTQ+, etc., and the old problems of race, ethnocentrism, and so forth. And we cannot forget that even religious affiliation or confession can constitute a domain or an area or sector with its corresponding rights, duties, and responsibilities. Therefore, context can be any dimension in which moral actors consider as integral to their sociocultural identity, generating rights and duties. To speak of context as existential in the philosophical sense is to point to that locus or place, in quotation marks, from which one views all of reality, on which one stakes one's values, within which one makes a choice of personal authenticity. Beyond the personal, however, moral context refers to something beyond the ordinary face-to-face human interaction with one's neighbor, as is defined by space and time or history and culture. Context can refer to social space. And how significant this is for Filipinos can be illustrated, for example, by ordinary phenomena like their differential behavior in jeepneys, or when they are together in cars in an enclosed space, or by their preference to entertain at the kitchen table over the living room for a relaxed and more informal interaction with those one considers hindi ibang tao. Social space imposes direct possibilities for human agency as well as limitations on the same at the larger context of organizations and institutions. These can be societal, economic, political, religious, and so on, which is why when one applies for a job and goes and joins an organization, one of the first orientations is to the culture of the organization. Social space extends to the world we carry in our minds as culture, since this involves psychosocial circumscriptions which can condition our perceptions of the morally realistic or ethically impossible. Many a comment has already been made that Filipinos who regularly violate traffic rules in the Philippines do so religiously in another context where they know that the laws are going to be applied. Anthropologists break down the boundaries within which we operate, the little worlds we operate, into three socio-moral contexts characterized as kami, and that refers to the family, the in-group, the close friends, yung mga matatalik na mga kaibigan, or even friendly strangers in a barkada, in a fraternity, etc. They have been assigned privileged status. They are part of the inmost circle. Beyond the inmost circle, there is an inclusive space where we talk of not kami, but tayo. And that is applied to acquaintances or friendly strangers in order to create space for further interaction. Beyond that, everybody else is either an unfriendly stranger or a formal enemies. Sila. Hindi kami, hindi tayo, sila. This phenomenon is not new to the Philippines. It has parallels in other cultures. You can compare this, for example, with the Papua New Guinea Wantok, which is a social support system which requires that help be given no matter what, including acts of vicarious and solidary vengeance. Dirido, for example, in southern Philippines, or the Pangat in the Cordilleras. Or you can think of the South African Ubuntu, which means I am, because you are, or we are, or this is the correct way of relating to other human beings. That can be read not only as an anthropological feature, but also as an ethical illustration of how we must or we consider normative relationships with kapwa. For counterpoint, you can even go and take a look at the religious level because that has become current in our culture. The parable of the Good Samaritan is about breaking those boundaries consciously. It's a call to a higher code, to go beyond those social boundaries in order to consider kapwa no longer those that are excluded because of contingent features, but to include them on the basis precisely of human need, humaneness, bait. You can see that in Jesus' treatment of the Syrophoenician woman whom initially rejected on the basis of a cultural preference, but who acquiesced when she proclaimed her equality as someone who also was a believer. You can see this reaction of the apostles when they went or attempted to cross through a Samaritan town, and they were refused because it was evident that they were on the way to pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Let's take a closer look at pakikipagkapwa-tao as context. According to Psikolehiyang Pinoy, the structure of Pinoy interpersonal relationships is divided into two sets of relationships, yung ibang tao. And this ibang tao consists of pakikitungo, that has been translated as transaction or civility with the outsider, which can graduate to a higher stage of pakikisalamuha or interaction with, or pakikilahok, the third, joining, participating with, graduating to pakikibagay, in conformity, in accord with, and even pakikisama, being along with. On the other hand, when someone has passed through those initial circles of strangeness, but already kapwa, one enters into more intimate space where the alien character, the strangeness, the foreign, is no longer perceived as a significant feature in the relationship. One is no longer ibang tao, kundi di ibang tao. And at that level, you can recognize interactions of pakikipagpalagayan, as in pakikipagpalagayang loob, being in rapport, because this person is now one of us. It can lead to understanding, acceptance with, like when we entertain people and say, oh, ituring mo parang bahay mo ito, hindi ka naman bisita. From pakikipagpalagayang loob, you can move to pakikisangkot. This is getting involved with. Because pakikipagpalagayan can be only at the level of friendly interaction, but no commitments. Pakikisangkot, however, already goes to commitments. And the highest stage, the ideal is pakikiisa, where one is one with. That is the highest form of the ibang tao. Now, when we look at context, we said that this is where pagpapakatao and pakikipagkapwa-tao are tested, constructed, synthesized. Because although the law of structures between me and you and any other are basically similar, the overall configurations can be dissimilar. And that is what makes for differences in personality. In other words, pare-pareho tayong merong malay, dama, ugali, isip, bait, loob. But the ways these are configured are different from each other. And phenomenologically, the relationships between the two loob can be merely intersubjective. That is, I relate to you, malay sa malay, dama sa dama, halimbawa. O kaya isip sa isip, in the academic world. Or bait sa bait, in a marriage encounter, and so forth. That's intersubjective. But it can become seriously interpersonal, where one is not only engaging at the level of one element, but on a series of elements, and that is precisely what accounts for the distinction between iba at the ibang tao. Parenthetically, according to the diagram that you're looking at, one might even see parallels here with the dynamics of cross-cultural encounters, such as acculturation and the like. Now that is by way of background, looking at context from the social sciences. when we take a look at it more precisely in a focused way as a moral phenomenon, then we draw the conclusion that the intersubjective is the locus of moral interaction, and the interpersonal is the occasion for interaction. Because when we compare the two sets of interactions, then you can say on the one side that the first person wants to relate with you with pakikitungo, gusto makitungo sa iyo, pero maaari kang tumugon ng pakikitungo rin, o ayaw mong makitungo, o bibiglain mo ng makipagpapaligayang loob. And we see that encounter precisely in bus rides, particularly on a long journey. Some people never talk to anyone. Some people start a conversation. And some people become friends at the end of the journey. So the series, the possibilities of interaction have to be met on the other side, but it has to be initiated from one side at the very least. So that is on the intersubjective side. Moral interaction is made possible because, as we said, loob 1 and loob 2 are similar. That similarity creates the possibility of interaction in the first place. But at the same time, they're individually different. And it is that individual difference that drives the interaction. Because of the difference, there is something to try and reconcile. Unfortunately, there is a third characteristic of loob, and that is it is opaque. It is not something that becomes completely transparent, not even to oneself. That is what he indicated earlier. Totoong mahiwaga ang loob ng tao. Mahirap itong arukin, lalong-lalo na kung gusto mong sisirin ang kaibuturan ng loob. So, this is due to both the structure of loob as well as the dynamics of galaw. Freedom intensifies all the dynamics even further because every interaction has to be free. And that is why friendship is not a given, but it is something that has to be built and constructed every day. Married couples understand that. And that is why over just the space of one day, you can have quarrels, you can have reconciliations, you can have annoyances, you can have joys, you can have the whole panoply of emotions that characterize any intense relationship. So pakikipagkapwa is not only intersubjective but interpersonal. It involves the body as well, and with that, the word and objects. And that is why, for example, human sexuality is so difficult to understand, because this does not consist only in a physical interaction. It does not only consist in sweet words. It does not only consist in giving gifts to one another. It is a fusion of all of those, which is why the sexual companionship in marriage is a journey not lightly to be undertaken. The externalization of loob through object, word, and body is not automatic. It is given in freedom, and hence at different levels of kusang loob and sadya, which can be freely given, completely given, but also completely withdrawn, as we have just witnessed in the court action between Johnny Depp and Amber Heard. Moral action and interaction are rendered possible by at least three types of similar differential relationships. Magkaloob, openness, because magkaloob can occur, be initiated from one side, but it can also be refused on the other side. But once magkaloob occurs on both sides, then you go to the second stage of magkasing loob. maghuhulihan kayo ng loob. Titingnan ninyo kung pareho ang inyong pinangmulan, kung pareho ang inyong damdamin tungkol sa mga bagay-bagay, kung magkakasundo kayo sa inyong pag-uugali, kung paano kayo mag-isip at mga tuwiran, kung ang inyong pinagpapahalagan ba ay magkakaugnay o magkakatugma, at kung pareho kayo ng hinahanap sa buhay. That is similarity. And where all of that has been accomplished to a higher degree, that is where you have reciprocity or magkalooban. The moral dimensions then of pakikipagkapwa can be much more explicitly stated when we use the moral terms and identify the moral elements much more specifically. So the moral dimensions of pakikipagkapwa can be illustrated when we take a look at loob on one side and loob 2 on the other side, and line up the different moral elements such as genotypal will, the moral sense, affectivity, moral reason, and conscience. Because on the other side, the same elements can be differently arranged. One might want to reason, where on the other side, one simply wants to be accepted. One may already want to do something, where one still is temporizing, and so on. So these are the points of contact in moral interaction. So moral interaction are rendered possible by at least 3 types of similar differential relationships: openness, similarity, and reciprocity. Though freely chosen, actions such as these are converted into actual moral principles, hindi na lang magkaloob kundi pagkakaloob, hindi lang magkasing loob kundi pagkakasing loob, at hindi magkalooban described, but pakikipagkalooban as prescribed. A few ethical postscripts at this particular point. Loob ethics actually parallels the personalist notions that we find in the Jewish philosophers Buber or Levinas, one who introduced the distinction between the I, the it, the thou, and the we. The I as subject cannot relate with another person as an it, but can only relate at a personal, interpersonal level as a thou, someone similar to I, equal to I, if we are to join a higher unity called we. Levinas comes to a similar insight, but using the concept of face. One who has looked into the face and the eyes of another intimately can no longer be the same. As in the existentialist philosophy of the West, kapwa for the Philippines is such only when regarded in its status as tao, recognized as a human being, and never reduced into something like an object, reified, objectified, or worse, demeaned as hayop, as when we brutalize similarly to animals, and most certainly not converted into kaaway, where sometimes we confuse rivalry with hostility. Human galaw, gawa at kilos, must correspondingly be tapat bilang kilos, meaning faithful to humane behavior, and also karapat-dapat bilang gawa, appropriate as deed. Adopting this stance consistently authenticates the moral character of the human person. This translates, in a way, to a common insight expressed in many different ways in different cultures, and that is the golden rule, or in its Filipino version, bago mo batiin ang uling ng iba, pahirin muna ang uling mo sa mukha. Maraming salamat po sa inyong pakikinig.